Well, welcome everyone. I'm Karen LaFrazia. I'm the president and CEO here at St. Francis House, and welcome to, I think, our third now State of the Agency address. Just a quick little housekeeping thing. Everybody's on mute, and if we're gonna, I think, have some really interesting discussion, but we are going to save some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But so again, I'm Karen LaFrazia, and I am joined here today with Andrea Farina, our Vice President of Program Strategy and Initiatives. And we're here to talk about the crisis at Mass and Cass and the St. Francis House response to that. And that's the Willows at Woods. And what we're hoping to be able to do today is to share with you how far we've come in a very, very short span of time in meeting the needs of some extremely vulnerable women within the homeless population that were staying in tents down in the encampments at Mass Ave. At the sort of, just to backtrack a little bit, give some perspective here. It was really, I think it was at the end of the fall, probably just as we were starting to approach winter, that we were approached by the city, and the situation had really reached an intolerable crisis point down at Mass and Cass. And the city approached us and asked us to join in an effort with them, the Boston Public Health Commission, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, other homeless and healthcare providers, and to really take a public health approach to this crisis. And I think that's the critically important thing I want to get across here, is that we're really orienting ourselves in our response through the lens of looking at this from a health perspective. And we were asked to create a new type of transitional shelter specifically for women. And the focus on that shelter really needed to be first and foremost on keeping people safe. These are women that have been staying in the tents, some for multiple years. And so while the first goal and objective is always safety, but it was also with the ultimate goal of being able to move women on a path to recovery and to permanent housing. So Andrea, when we were approached, we sort of put our heads together and said, okay, Andrea, we have to take this, which was just a concept at that moment. We didn't even, initially, we didn't even have we didn't have space.
Yeah.
We
No
had
staff, no space.
No staff, no space. But within about 2 months, we problem solved for all of those things. And we were able to identify with the Boston Public Health Commission a space in the city of Boston's women's shelter. It's known as Woods Mullen. And we were able to turn that into a fully staffed, dignified, welcoming, safe, as I said before, transitional shelter.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it was quite a journey, let me tell you, to get from last fall to here. A lot of lessons learned, a lot of work by a lot of people. I mean, you named some of our partners in this effort.
Yep.
But also the St. Francis House staff who work at 39 Boylston Street,
incredible,
who just across the board raised their hand and said, we should do this, we have to do this, and individually we will make the time, we will make the extra effort to do it. And you and I looked at each other in that room that day and we thought, well, we can't not do this,
right.
Because
right.
Now our staff would say, no, we have to.
Right.
And so, I mean, the situation at Mass and Cass, we've all seen it in the news. And in the newspaper, just as a reminder of really what that encampment looks like. We have a few photos that show really what's happening and what's been happening, or what had been happening down at Mass and Cass, and just hundreds and hundreds of people living in tents night after night, and particularly for the women who were there facing just intolerable circumstances, physically, emotionally. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but maybe if you want to say something about how we got here.
Well, yes, because I think it's really important to understand we just saw the images on the screen. And so, when I talk to people, they say, like, how did that happen? Why are there so many people living in tents, in really desperate circumstances? So I think we have to understand the way systems of care are aligned and how they're not aligned. And, so we have a system that really responds to people who are experiencing homelessness. We have systems of care that respond to people with a substance use disorder. And then there's the intersection of those systems, right? People who are homeless trying to access treatment or detox or getting on a pathway there. And what we know is that there's shortcomings in both of those systems to be able to meet the unique needs of a subset of that population of people who are both homeless and have a substance use disorder. And when we see the inabilities of those two systems to be able to completely and adequately meet the needs of this population, what we end up with is their needs not being met. Now, in Massachusetts, in Boston, we have really good treatment and recovery options for people who have a substance use disorder, but they don't always work for people who are experiencing homelessness. And that's one of the reasons why before this, we're launching our own on-site treatment program, but I think we'll save that.
Another state of the
We'll save that
agency.
for another state of the agency. But we know we need to be able to bring treatment to people with a substance use disorder and make it available to them in the ways in which they can accept it, receive it, and need it. And so when you think about somebody who's struggling with an opioid use dependency, or what you have to understand is that often that is defined by ambivalence. There are people who at the very moment that they're actively using a substance, they're in the same breath, crying out and wishing, I wish I could stop. And it goes back and forth. And, there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of hopelessness that gets embedded in that. And there are moments of like, I wish I could move beyond this experience, but then you meet barriers, you meet emotional barriers. There's physical exhaustion, there's emotional exhaustion, there's fear. There's fear and there's sadness sometimes. It's sometimes hard to wrap your head around, but there is a community of people that look out for each other and care for each other, even in those conditions, and even in people who are using drugs, and stepping away from that can be anxiety provoking for somebody. And it doesn't take much to sort of make a fragile attempt at recovery and then 3 steps back. And so, whether it's transportation, exhaustion, insurance related things, these are enough roadblocks, little bumps in the road that really make it challenging for somebody to be able to access the good treatment that we do have in the city and across the state. So that often leads people to, their ongoing addiction, their ongoing use, often leads people to ending up finding themselves in a homeless situation. So now somebody's homeless. And again, in Boston, we have amazing homeless providers. We have what I think is one of the best systems of care across the country. And we have great shelters, great providers. And the shelter system is, in Boston, it's a low threshold shelter system, which means trying to, putting the entrance into the shelter as barrier-free as possible. And so in that, people are being welcomed, people with a substance use disorder, mental health issues, people coming out of prison with disabling conditions. And so there's few restrictions that are being placed on people to come into shelter. And, another really good thing from the city of Boston is the city has made a commitment that if anybody who wants a shelter bed, we can create a shelter bed for them. However, what is good about that, right, is that it's low threshold, people come in. there's sometimes unintended consequences of that. And, shelters are overcrowded. I'm looking at the picture that's on the screen. Some of you may never have actually been inside a homeless shelter. And so, so just to give a sense of, if I'm somebody coming in and, sleeping side by side, 2 feet away, or in a bunk bed, with 100 or 150 other people, all in very with their own challenges and struggles. It can be overwhelming. It's overstimulating, and it feels for some unsafe. And so, sometimes the choice is being made to not access into a shelter. And one of the things I have to say is that shelter is working for a lot of people. For the majority of people that are going into the shelter, it's actually the first step to really being able to get into permanent housing. And so I know in Boston, in our shelter system, we've been making great strides in getting people into permanent housing. And, just at St. Francis House alone, for instance, in the last 6 months, we've housed over 100 people into housing. So that's good, but it's not necessarily working. Traditional shelters aren't necessarily working for people. I just saw how long it's been. So all of you who know me know that I talk too much. So we don't have a lot of time here, so I'm going to have to try to speed it up. So, so why doesn't traditional shelter work for people, right? Especially if you're somebody who has a substance use disorder, or in particular an opioid use disorder, withdrawal, after you've used, withdrawal symptoms can set in very quickly, and you have to be able to manage those symptoms, because people get very, very sick. And shelters don't allow people to come and go. Like, once you're in for the night. And then if you leave, you're out for the night. So with all of that, there's these two systems that aren't necessarily being able to meet, again, a subset of the population of people, especially when their commitment to sobriety is fledgling, the access to treatment is hard, the shelter option doesn't align well with what they need. And that's how we got here. I mean, there's other factors, but I think that we don't have enough time for all of that. But we end up with encampments, and I guess I'm going to say we're not unique. I mean, these encampments are all over the country. It's not unique to Boston, but there's Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. I said, and but Boston is different from other cities, and it's not just in the size of the problem, but it was in our approach. And I think this is again, going back to taking a public health perspective, Mayor Wu was very intentional, and she took an informed and a compassionate approach and looked at it from a public health perspective. She was clear the tents needed to come down. This was not good for anybody, but instead of just bulldozing the tents and displacing people, people went into the encampment. There was a survey that was done of 143 people that were living in about 90 tents. And it was a commitment was made to ensure that every one of those people that was surveyed was identified and was going to be able to go into a transitional, shelter.
It was a Herculean effort, really.
It was.
I mean, when you think about all the work that all the partners were doing on the ground to convince people that there was a different option and a different opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we had our own staff going down.
Yeah.
We have 2 harm reduction specialists. We had our members from our recovery support center who are in recovery in a peer way. We're reaching out to people, but we really needed to be able to convince people that something was going to be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, so we had to create something that was different. It was something that would not just be your traditional low threshold shelter, but it had to be a shelter that first embraced our philosophy of care, that it really was centered on each person as a unique individual, that it really wrapped the values of being recovery oriented, and that it really understood the trauma, the significant trauma that women in particular were experiencing out on the streets. And how do we take that philosophy and embed that into this new thing that hadn't been done before? And so, you know, coming off of our success at, you know, I think it was last winter or the winter before, it was track of time, but, you know, when we were once again called upon, it's like, okay, go find this hotel. And we opened up a hotel in Brighton for 6 months and ran a 100-bed shelter out of that. So we learned from that, and Andrea led that effort, and you led this effort.
True. That's true. You know, I'll say that operating the shelter in Brighton last year was an incredible experience. I tell people what a great way to spend the COVID winter. And the reason that I say that is because it gave me the opportunity to move away from my office, which is where I had been spending most of my time, and really on the ground and get to know each of the 100 guests that we had at that site. And why that matters, I think, to what we're doing today is it was a visceral and timely reminder of how many strengths and talents people have that's hidden behind, in some cases, their addiction. I heard from people who had the opportunity to stay there, who I could see the fear in their eyes if they thought that they were going to have to go back to the Mass and Cass area. They didn't want to go back. It was a place of fear, and they were grateful to be able to be away from there. So it really queued up the opportunity at our shelter. I think, you know, you talked a little bit about harm reduction and different approaches to how we look at people who use drugs. Maybe you'll talk a little bit about.
We should talk about what harm
reduction is. And I'll start by saying, I practiced harm reduction on my way to work today.
Okay.
I was in Boston traffic, like I'm guessing a lot of you were today, and I put on my seatbelt. And my dad, who's 75 years old, likes to mountain bike. Rugged mountains, rugged terrain. He's 75. He still does it every day. He puts on a helmet. So these are inherently risky activities that the potential harm that could come from an inherently risky activity is reduced by taking a different action. Now, obviously, that's a little different than using drugs. I mean, you talked a little bit about stigma and shame that comes with that. And there's no doubt that using drugs is a very different activity than riding a mountain bike. But the principle is the same. It's taking a judgment-free approach and saying, you're doing an activity that's inherently risky. What can you do to reduce the possibility that there will be further harm to you? And, you know, that's really hard when we're talking about something that's so very stigmatized.
But it's so important, because if you don't reduce the harm, I mean, ultimately, you can die.
Right. I mean, you start with the substance use disorder as a disease, right? So you start with the premise that we understand that it's a disease. And then without these kinds of interventions, you absolutely, you can die. And then the person doesn't even have a future to look forward to. So when we talk about rebuilding lives at St. Francis House, if we can't first keep people safe and help them keep themselves safe, there's no life to rebuild. We don't want to see people introduce additional disease on top of the struggle that they already have with substance use disorder. So I think the key part about harm reduction for us, and we haven't always, you know, known a lot about harm reduction. I mean, Karen, you remember maybe 5 years ago or so, you know, we were still learning about what that means. And St. Francis House has long come to this work with placing the value on the dignity of the human being, on being really person-centered and understanding how people make choices, and we want to respect those choices, build trust that helps them see the value in themselves to move forward. And that's really what harm reduction is too. But it took us a while ourselves to move beyond thinking, well, is this somehow condoning drug use? Is this encouraging drug use, these practices? And we came to realize it's absolutely not. It's about creating safety and making sure that people understand and can see the value in themselves so that they can make those hard choices to seek treatment, for example. Right now, when people are using drugs, they're making very rational decisions to use drugs. They're going, because if they have a disease, they're managing their drug use, they're managing the symptoms of their use, they become violently ill, as you were saying, when they have a drug in their body and they need to use again. They're not doing it to get high. They're
Yep.
doing it to feel normal. So in a lot of ways, that's a very rational response to being able to figure out, how do you get beyond that? And they get stuck in it, and they get stuck in it. And so how can we help them get unstuck? It starts by making sure they're safe. And there's some very specific practices that we can use to do that. One of the things that harm reduction is about that philosophy, valuing the human being, getting rid of the stigma, but it's also about very specific practices. So some of those practices are ensuring that when people are using drugs, that the tools that they use to use those drugs, and particularly injecting drugs, are clean and sterile. That the needle, the syringe that they're using to inject the drug hasn't been used 3 times before and rolling around in their backpack. Hasn't been used by somebody else.
Because I would imagine that contamination
Right.
leads to Hep C,
Right.
HIV infections.
And HIV infections are skyrocketing
going
right
here,
now,
right.
which is really concerning
Right.
from all sorts of perspectives. And even just wounds that can be created from bacterial infections
Abscesses.
that create all sorts of problems. So, making sure that the water that they're using is clean and not drawn from a puddle or a toilet. So another very just on the ground practice in harm reduction, not only making sure that they have those tools, but also reminding people and helping people to not use alone. Because if you imagine something that you're feeling is shameful and stigmatizing, you might be inclined to find a dark corner to do that. And that's when the risk of overdose skyrockets.
Right.
If somebody's using, I know that this is what we do at our shelter, we encourage them to do it together. We make sure that they have Narcan available. And because that can reverse an overdose. And those are the ways that people can stay alive while we're building the trust that says, I understand this is a choice you're making today. We want to help you make a different choice to have a valuable life tomorrow.
Just think we really need to underscore that point, because I think that, sometimes when people talk about a harm reduction model of care, it can sound as if there's you're, like you said this earlier, condoning drug use. Or enabling people, that's other language that we've used. And it's actually quite the opposite. It's about being able to, like you're saying, keep people safe, keep people alive, so that they can live to make a different decision and make that different decision because we have valued them. You were saying that earlier.
Right.
And then if we're valuing them, they can see the value in themselves. And so it is about bringing to folks other options, different choices. So I know we need to, we just got the sign.
So
Willows.
So how do you take all of those practices and align that with a shelter model?
Right.
We saw some images before about, what traditional sheltering looks like. You touched on it a little bit. And, when we were asked to put these principles together, as you said, we needed to find a site. We did that with our partners, Boston Public Health Commission. This is the Woods Mullen Shelter for Women that's operated by the Boston Public Health Commission. It's still operational. And what we have is the 5th floor of this building. So we share the building. The traditional shelter operates under their guidance and the 5th floor operates under ours. But the site was raw at the time and we needed to make it warm and bring it to life. I know we have some of the photos of some of the spaces
before and after.
Before, and the commission said to us, well, we have this 5th floor, do you want it? When we saw it, we saw, for example, the light that comes in the windows. We knew that it had the bones, but we had a ton of work to do to make it happen.
Very quickly.
We along the way, we needed to do some significant work in the bathrooms. In particular, we installed a bathroom monitoring system. And what that does is it ensures that if people are overdosing and they become additionally sedated, they're in a medical emergency, that they can't hide behind a bathroom stall, that we can't lose them in the process, because of course that's a place you would typically give someone appropriate privacy. So what it does is it alerts the staff if somebody hasn't been moving in there for a particular amount of time, so that we can just do a shout out and say, hey, Karen, are you okay? So there were small and large investments that we needed to make in the space. Along the way, we reached out to find a security company and all of the operational things that we needed, bring all the supplies on site, furnish the space, identify and train the staff. So I talked before about the commitment that our staff made. Just right off the bat, we could not have opened without that commitment. We found two wonderful people who had background and complementary skills in the treatment world and in homeless services to come and operate the site. And what you're seeing right here is and because this was all so fast, we put together everybody who had been hired to work at the site. For most of the people in these slides, in these photos, this was the first time they had seen the site. And this was 3 days before Christmas. We brought them all together for a training and pizza and started talking about what this was going to be. But all of it was still emerging. You know, we were building the plane as we were flying it, as they say.
And the only thing I want to also mention on staff training, and I don't know if you're going to say this before, you've made an incredible commitment to ongoing training.
Oh, very much
so. I mean, while there was this initial infusion of training, it is a learning process. And so I just, want people to understand like the significant investment in learning and educating and listening to the women and training on those issues that's been happening.
Yeah, we've been doing a different training probably every other week, which is no small feat when you have 24-hour staff, and we currently have
7 days a week,
24 people, human beings working at the site. And I mean, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless has been an incredible partner in that way. Boston Public Health Commission Office of Recovery Services, they've all been lending their expertise and to help us learn more along the way with the staff and ourselves. And it strengthens our program. We opened, but when we opened, we didn't have all that. We had a vision. We had a lot of heart and soul. We have our St. Francis House model. But the day that we opened the Willows at Woods, 2 days after Christmas, we didn't know everything we know now. What you'll see here is a photo of, along with one of our wonderful staff people, a willow tree. And one of the things to know about a willow tree, we chose this, and actually it was one of our new directors who came in who said, can we name this the Willows? Because that really means something to me about the women and what we're doing. And as it turns out, the willow tree has a long history and lots of cultural traditions about resilience and strength. I actually learned that I didn't know this, if you cut off a willow tree branch and you plant it, it will grow a new tree. So much of what is about the willow tree is rejuvenative powers, it's hope, it's resilience, and how you can build something new out of something.
So how did you transform?
Let's take a look. So we had the photo from before, a more traditional shelter. And the Willow shelter, we really wanted to make it as warm and comfortable as possible in all the ways that we present the space. So you'll notice that these are home-like comforters, home-like dressers. Every woman who comes to our shelter has their own designated bed, a lamp, a dresser that is theirs and theirs alone. I'll show you later, they have their own locker where they can store things that they want to keep safe and private for themselves. So it was really important, and is really important, that the women who come to us have that kind of consistency and that sense of home. When you're in a traditional shelter, they're built for efficiency, and for a lot of people, it's really important that way. It works really well for a lot of people. It doesn't work so well for others. And certainly for our women, traditional sheltering, because of the way it's organized, just doesn't fit, as you were saying before. So every woman has their own bed that's theirs, and they keep that from day to day for as long as they're there. We have open access living and dining area. We do receive meals in our partnership with the Health Commission. They provide the meals to us, and they're brought to the floor by our staff every day. But if a woman isn't there to eat her meal at the time it comes, that's okay. It's going to be in the fridge and she can have it later. So this is open access 24 hours a day. to eat when it suits you, to relax when it suits you. It's a gathering space, and we really appreciate that. We also, we have another lounge area that just has a very peaceful feeling to it. We've had women who really enjoy coloring and kind of that meditative time away from others in their own space. They use that space. The shelter provides 24-hour access. So what that means is, and I think you were saying this a little bit before, in traditional sheltering, you need to show up at a certain time of the day to get your bed. A bed will be assigned to you. It may or may not be the same bed you had the night before. It's a fresh process every day. You get assigned, you come in, and if you leave, you can't come back. And then in the morning at around 5 or 6, it's time to up and at 'em and have your breakfast and out the door. There's some flexibility in that in some places.
Shelters are evolving to be more accommodating, but I think that what you're seeing here is institutional versus more home-like. Flexibility versus more rigidity, smaller versus larger. So the principles that need to be embedded along with the harm reduction things that we talked about earlier.
And we have security presence and staff obviously available 24 hours to welcome the women in safely and to be there for them.
Lockers,
One of the key components to the harm reduction work is making sure that people feel like they can come in and present as they are. And that means that many of our women weren't going into shelter for some of the reasons we talked about, but also because they have items that are prohibited from traditional shelter. Drugs, drug paraphernalia, things that keep them safe on the street that are seen as weapons and can be used as weapons. And those things, for understandable reasons, and traditional sheltering can't be allowed in the door. So we worked hard to figure out how can we allow the women to keep that with them and know that those belongings are available to them when they leave and they go out into the unsafe streets and they manage their addiction as they need to without having it open in our space. So very, very briefly, what we do is we ask the women as they come into the shelter to put all of those restricted belongings in one of these pink boxes. And every pink box that you see, we call it our amnesty box, is every woman has one. And she puts everything that would be restricted in that box, we lock it and we bring it up to the floor and we keep it in a locked locker. But we, the staff, know it's hers, her belongings. She knows it's hers. And when she wants to access it again, it's only when she is ready to go out and we give it to her again outside of the building so that she can retrieve her belongings. So that's kept in a very secure place down the hall, but not in her possession while she's there. And that's made a huge difference. We're not the only place who does that sort of thing in Boston or around the country, but it is an emerging focus. The other lockers that you see there are for the women themselves. They have access to those lockers to just put whatever, they have a special cereal or a sweatshirt that they want to make sure doesn't disappear. Another really important component of our work is that we have nursing on site. Boston Healthcare for the Homeless is a fantastic partner to St. Francis House in general, and certainly in this process. And they've provided us not only with training, but with active support on site. The Health Commission has arranged for us to have some nursing overnight. And what having nursing does is a few things. One, it allows us to, if a woman is experiencing the effects of an opiate overdose and becomes very sedated, we don't have to have a black or white response. It doesn't have to be necessarily a moment of fear for the staff or the other women. It doesn't have to be an abrupt Narcan response that brings them back in a very challenging way. It can be, let's just make sure she's okay. Is her breathing okay? Is she getting enough oxygen? Is she being cared for? Is her body handling it? The nursing and the harm reduction work can help us with that. And our staff is getting better at doing that as well. What you're seeing here is one of the chairs that we call sedation monitoring chair. that's in our space that we use with the women. And we have Narcan kits and first aid kits throughout the space so that we, the staff or the medical staff that provide support to us, can also intervene.
But I would imagine it's also, having, I mean, there are other physical and medical needs that women have that go beyond, monitoring.
Absolutely. I mean, they're medically complex.
Right.
Many of them have HIV. Others have, endometriosis, long-term chronic illness.
Right.
They have a lot of behavioral health needs.
Right.
Mental health concerns, mental illness.
So
They're very complicated.
They're complicated. And I think what I have valued so much about this particular model of care is that it's, it understands the substance use disorder, but it actually is very holistic. And it's really looking at the physical needs, the behavioral health needs, the chronic disease versus, sort of an acute episode that might happen. Right.
Yeah.
So,
and many of our women are engaged in sex work and are doing that in the community as part of this like ongoing traumatization and ongoing way of life right now. We had a woman very early on who came to us with a really acute bladder infection. And we were able to, even though she came in at 2 o'clock in the morning, we were able to intervene with her without sending her out to the emergency room, without her needing to face the stigma and shame that would come from that and explaining what was going on. And we were able to bridge her to care because we had that medical support on site.
Andrea, can you talk about, what the experience of these women has been? I mean, we're talking about what the model of care, but ultimately what really matters is how are the women receiving this? How have they responded? And, are we seeing a positive impact as a result of this different way of doing things?
Yeah, we are absolutely seeing a positive impact. And also, we've been there since the end of December, right? So,
That's short.
But what we see, and I think the thing that makes the most difference is that the women are starting to call it home. And we've heard from people and other providers in the community who've known some of them individually over time for years and years, who are amazed. I can't believe that, Susie, that Susie is still there. I can't believe that she stayed.
Yeah, right.
I heard her say she's going home. So the fact that it's having that impact is huge. When they first come in, it's like the first 2 days are nothing but eating and sleeping.
Right. It's just exhausted.
They're exhausted, absolutely exhausted. Over time, we've started to see that people are accepting treatment, seeking out treatment. They are reducing their use. So where maybe at first they were much more chaotic, we've seen them settle in to more of a routine, to more consistency. And consistency is the foundation in so many ways of being able to establish a new way of life.
And I just really want to underscore that, because I think that, we're sort of really sharing a very different way of approaching addiction, treatment, recovery. And the fact that I know in these very short weeks and months, we've actually started to see women contemplating and engaging in recovery-oriented services, whether that's medication-assisted treatment or looking for a way to really, with that consistency, with that trust, with those supports that weren't in that chaotic existence in the tents, are now often for the very first time and successfully engaging in treatment.
Because even when there was outreach to the tents, it wasn't able to be as consistent and their lives weren't. But they know that if they wake up today and they want to talk to somebody about it, we're right there.
Right.
And if they don't want to today, we're going to be there tomorrow, and we're going to be there the next day. And we want to work with them. We've had women who, there was one, Karen, I know I told you about this, but there was a woman who was really, what we might say decompensating. She was really struggling with deep trauma. She had used, she has some mental health concerns that need to be addressed. Just very complicated, and was just kind of falling apart. And our staff went in and she's just on the floor, crumpled up, and just held her and said, "It's going to be okay," and just sat with her, and then tucked her into bed that night. And I know, And when I heard about this story, I mean, I get it now, the goosebumps, because what the staff person told me, and it brought tears to her eyes, is she tucked her in, and the woman looked at her and said, "Why do you care? Why do you care about, why are you doing this for me? Nobody's ever done this for me." You know, and it's those moments, and I know they happen even more often than I know, because it's the day-to-day lives of what it means as somebody is starting to feel that they have value again and are valued.
So I know, I almost feel like I want to end it there. Because one, I mean, what more can you say, right?
Yeah.
And it's 12:42. And so I know that, we were, scheduled to only go for, 45 minutes. I know we wanted to still save some time for some Q&A. And, but I think that, I guess what I will just tell you right now is like, what's next, right? And so I think what we can say is that we've learned a lot through the experiences of COVID and, the overcrowded and shelters and needing to really depopulate those shelters. And so we've been part of that effort. Other shelters have been part of that effort. Again, this experience with bringing down the tents and finding a new way of doing, supporting people. So I think the whole system is undergoing a transformation right now, and it's going to take time. But the intention is that we'll be part of that. The city of Boston is part of that. The commission's part of that. And everybody's really leading the way to envision a new way of providing shelter for women. Oh yeah, I just see that
Yeah, and I think this is a wonderful image.
Yeah,
to share.
And maybe that's what, I am so sorry, folks. We are out of time, but I guess what I'd like to leave you with is this image, because, that image, we don't need to show the other images. That's where people had left. And this is what people have found. And they're finding themselves again, they're finding treatment, and they will find housing. So I thank you all for joining us here today. The 45 minutes went by really quick. I look forward to being able to be available to talk to anybody outside of this call and engaging further in the conversation. So thank you all for your support, and look forward to talking with you again and reporting further out on this. Be well and have a great day.
Thank you all.